afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for being here. Thanks, Eric, for putting us all together. So my name is Chrissy Hall. I've been in healthcare my entire life, starting out as a combat medic in the US Navy for 10 years, and then working clinically in emergency medicine and pathology before transitioning to healthcare technology and innovation. As Eric mentioned, I'm a Darden Gemba 17, went back to school a little later in life, and then received my doctorate in business with a focus in strategy and innovation. I currently am the principal healthcare industry advisor, go-to-market specialist, and business development lead for AWS Healthcare and Life Sciences. Joined by three other alumni that will introduce themselves. So Krishna, do you want to kick us off?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Pleasure to be with you. I'm Krishna Udaikumar, 1999 graduate of the College of Arts and Sciences, and I'm currently based at Duke University and serve there as the founding director of the Duke Global Health Innovation Center, where we're really focused on this intersection of innovation, policy, and global health, and how we solve some of these intractable global challenges. I also have the pleasure of leading a nonprofit that we host here that's called Innovations in Healthcare, that's very much focused on trying to find and support the best health startups around the world, and was co-founded by Duke along with McKinsey & Company and the World Economic Forum. So great to be here.
Thank you. Very excited to get that global perspective around healthcare from you too. Erin, can you please introduce yourself?
Sure. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to see so many fantastic folks on the line joining us today. I'm Erin Williams. I am managing director at MITRE, which is a nonprofit that operates sort of quasi-governmental, federally funded research and development centers on behalf of the U.S. government. I work on the one in healthcare, so focused very much on the folks in the Department of Health and Human Services. So there's obviously a lot of synergy. It's my third career. The first part, I led a nonprofit that I helped to launch, focused on genetic medicine. And interestingly, I found a lot of the issues that came up at the time still exist and exist in other areas of innovation as well. And then I spent about a decade on the Hill working for the Congressional Research Service, where I had the pleasure of being their first ever named specialist in biomedical ethics. So I was a biomedical person there, but I also leveraged my law degree. And it's a great pleasure to be here. I look forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. And Chong, can you please introduce yourself?
Thank you, Chrissy. Hi, everyone. This is Chong Xu. I'm a partner, currently a partner at Prime Capital, which is a Boston headquartered early stage healthcare venture capital fund. And we are also part of Fidelity Investment, which is the big mutual fund company, which Fidelity is our single LP essentially. So at that time, we invest in early stage startup companies across everything healthcare, so therapeutics, medical devices, diagnostics, tools, as well as healthcare, IT, and services. So my own background, so I am a double who. I went to Virginia, got my PhD in cell biology in 2009. And then I went and worked in a hedge fund in New York for a few years, went back to get my MBA at Darden 2014, and also did a little bit consulting before joining at Prime. That was 7 years ago. So happy to be here.
Great, thank you. So I kind of want to start off just talking about innovation in general. In my experience, innovation is a shiny buzzword. You see it all over. It's been in my job title for the last 6 years, both at my prior organization, which was Centera Healthcare, and now at AWS. But one of the things I'd like each of you to do, and I'll call on you separately, but I'd like you to understand, or I'd like the group to understand how you define innovations. One of the things I know as we talk with customers or people talk to me and they assume that we share a common definition of what innovation is. So I'd really like each of you to talk through how you define innovation. And Erin, start with you.
Great, thank you, Chrissy. I think I didn't mention that I was a graduate of the College of Arts and Sciences in 1990, so put that out there. Go Who's. So innovation, I think that there are a few different ways to look at it in healthcare. I think of it as being sort of new things generally. It could be a process, it could be a thing like a medical product. And in healthcare, I think there are, and in other areas, two sorts. One, it's an entirely new concept that no one's ever thought of before, the first light bulb, you know, whatever it is. And that's a kind that we're familiar with. But there's another kind that I think is equally valuable, which is really something that exists elsewhere that then is applied in this domain for the first time. And an example might be, we've worked a little bit with the idea of innovation bonds in healthcare. So bond financing, which is used to build buildings in other sectors, right, can be used maybe in certain ways in order to help spark innovation in the health system. And there's also sort of a longitudinal way to look at it. Certain parts of the government that we work with are very focused on the healthcare aspect. What happens sort of when something already exists? How do you get it out to people? You know, and that usually a lot of that has to do with payment incentives, do you know what I mean? And those kinds of innovations. But there's also the long pipeline, you know, how do you get the ideas and the products going through the pipeline to start? So I tend to look at it in terms of like early research ideas leading up to eventually getting to people, and then also the innovations that are required to that last mile really spark the solution going out into and helping people at the end of the day.
So I love that you touched on learnings from potentially other industries and how we can apply them, because healthcare is a little slow in change and adoption. And I think that is one thing that no one should overlook when you're looking for inspiration and ideas. There's this concept of the adjacent possible. How do I look what's happening in banking or telecommunications or other industries to apply those innovations to the healthcare and life sciences industry? So really, really love touching on that. Chong, how would you define innovation?
So I largely similar to what Aaron has explained, right? I mean, when we look at innovation in our industry, I mean, you're looking at very different buckets of innovation, right? There are innovations that happen in the form of, you know, just novel scientific discovery, for example, you know, gene editing, stem cells, different, you know, that come from years of basic science research that then find its way into, you know, actually faster and faster these days into application. But there are also places where you may be just kind of applying a new old drug to a new disease. You may be applying, you know, a framework or a tool that's, you know, to your earlier point, Chrissy, that has been used in other industries, right, to kind of try and solve old problems in healthcare or in drug discovery. You know, one of such example may be just kind of the increasing use of machine learning, AI in, you know, drug discovery or clinical trials and all that. So, you know, different levels or different types of innovation happening. I guess the ultimate kind of judge to that is, does that ultimately create value for patients, for physicians, for the industry, right, overall? I think then, you know, that's at least how I look at it.
Absolutely. No, that's great. And I think, you know, you're touching on value. Innovation for innovation's sake is something we tend to definitely shy away from because there's a cost associated with that, of course. So I really do appreciate how you touched on how do you identify what the potential value of an innovation can be. So thank you. And Krishna, how would you define innovation?
I certainly agree with everything Aaron and Chong have said. You know, we think about it pretty simply as something new that has positive impact on health or healthcare. Right? And I think it's got to meet both of that criteria, not necessarily new to the world, but new in the context in which it's being applied, like others have said as well. But just because it's new doesn't mean it's an innovation, right? It has to actually show that it improves health or healthcare, whether it's for patients, providers, other stakeholders. And we also think about, you know, what are the characteristics that make innovation successful, and we keep coming back when we study this to sort of 4 characteristics. One is it effective? There's so often in this space we don't actually know if something works. Well-intentioned, is it really interesting? It has a lot of hype around it, and we tend to start doing it without actually knowing what it does and how it does it. The second is it sustainable? So again, lots of new things are being tried, but if somebody's not going to pay for it because it's creating value, it's hard to say it's innovative and sustainable. The third is, can it be scalable, right? It's one thing to say you can do it for tens or hundreds of things, but can it reach scale in the millions or even more than that to be successful? And the last point is it equitable? So does it actually make sure that we're reaching toward improvements in equity? Because lots of innovations have that potential, but if they're not deployed correctly, if they're not financed, if they're not reaching the people who might need them most, we can actually exacerbate equity in it, as opposed to making it better.
No, I think those are one, I love the first statement. It was a simplistic definition. I think we often think of innovation as being exceptionally complicated. I think you also touched on the need to experiment. Innovation isn't something that it's a discipline, it can be formulaic, but in the end, there's still experimentation to know if it's going to be successful and prove out the value, if it's going to be scalable, and touching on equity, I think is absolutely incredible. And we're going to talk a little bit about that later in terms of data. But I think you all highlighted innovation. A lot of people immediately think it's the next iPhone, it's the next Tesla, and innovation can be business model innovation. It can be a new product. It can be a new methodology of bringing, let's say, a vaccine to market quicker. So there's a lot of different ways that innovation is leveraged, but I think ultimately it still follows that very simplistic definition of doing something in a new way. Okay. So we often hear that the necessity is the mother of all invention. So I'm going to ask each of you separately to answer a COVID-19 related question. We'd be remiss not bringing that up. It's probably one of the biggest things to happen to the healthcare industry and the world in a long time. And it's had a huge global impact and has changed healthcare and life sciences landscape a great deal. So I'm going to ask each of you to talk through some examples specific to your space where you have seen this. And Chong, I'd like to start with you.
So so my background and my experience is more on the drug development side. So I'll maybe just kind of touch upon the, a well-known example of how quickly, COVID vaccines and antivirals are being developed these days. I mean, that's just, for people who are familiar with drug development and vaccine development is a long process usually. It takes years, and we have vaccines that were developed 20, 30 years ago that are still being used today, right? So it's not a space that's kind of hard for innovation and known for speed per se. But COVID has essentially, completely changed that, right? A vaccine that's approved in essentially a year and a half or 2 years time. And, the new boosters are still being approved, right, as we speak. And also some of the antivirals that are just kind of pushed out in record speed. I mean, that's, when Krishna was talking about innovation in terms of, the impact that it can achieve, this is innovation, not just kind of in scientific discovery or innovation in the biotech industry, but innovation that happens at a grand scale throughout the ecosystem, throughout the industry, including the regulators, right? And what we see today is that innovation has had impact not just in the COVID space, but also, people are working on new vaccines for flu, for other infectious diseases. The amount of, learnings that happen in infectious diseases in the last 2 years is just astronomical, right? And a lot of those learnings are now being applied in other areas. So I see that as one of the most encouraging, evidence of innovation that can happen when everybody put their minds together.
Absolutely. Erin, how about you? How are you seeing a landscape change related to COVID-19?
COVID-19 was the pandemic. The global pandemic was a huge motivator that made a lot of things that were already or should have already been in place go, and also exposed. There were great successes, and there are some areas where it exposed issues in the system. Pandemic preparedness is something that we've been involved in for a long time. It's not new. And it was actually pretty disappointing to see, some failures with monkeypox that followed right after, where we already had the test and the vaccine, and yet, right, like it still could have been handled a little bit better. So I think there's some learnings going on. Some of the neat things, I mean, the mRNA vaccine coming to market was really interesting. That was definitely innovative. And I mean, it was based on technology that existed. There had been research on it before, but getting it going and using it in this way was really great to see. There was, parts of government pulled together. NIH had special panels, FDA as well, the Food and Drug Administration. So NIH, the largest funder of biomedical research, the Food and Drug Administration, the sole, approver basically of all products before they reach market for in healthcare, and then Medicare as well with payment, and the CDC obviously that's focused on prevention and the like, and tracking disease, all really came together along with the Assistant Secretary for, well, now it's the Administration for Strategic Preparedness and Response. They've changed their name. In order to see what, how to make things go, how to make them happen more quickly. And that it was all kinds of things. I mean, it was the vaccines, it was testing. How do you even know if you have a COVID test? How do you make sure the tests work well? It's a moving target because the virus is evolving, as we've all seen. PPE, masks. We all remember things. Companies getting repurposing so that suddenly everyone is able to make masks instead of leggings, and get those out where required. Advances in telehealth happened because suddenly in telebusiness and Zoom meetings, because suddenly getting together created big public health risks. And real fine-grained understanding too of global supply chains and global issues around how the science travels, how the products travel, and the like, came out. So there were a lot of really great stories. We moved very quickly. Also, though, it exposed issues with equity, right? It turns out not everybody benefited equally or was burdened equally. And unfortunately, folks who were already historically sort of disadvantaged were even more disadvantaged and had higher death rates and things like that from COVID. So I think it also it was both a great success and aspiration that is leading to things like ARPA-H, which is, just getting started, the DARPA for health, right? That where they want to build on the successes, but there's also attention to, to issues like equity that Krishna raised earlier.
Absolutely. And Krishna, I'm very excited to hear your point of view because we have very similar backgrounds in the provider side. So I'd love to hear how you have seen COVID-19 affect changes in your landscape.
Yeah, I first agree with everything Chong and Aaron have pointed out, and it's certainly consistent with what we're seeing as well. I'd say what it's done is really allowed us to reflect better on what we previously thought were fixed constraints, but aren't. Right? So as one small example, our local health system here, prior to the pandemic, was doing, maybe several hundred virtual visits a week. And within 60, 90 days, we were up to doing several thousand a day. So we proved to ourselves that not only was there a way to do it, but that when forced under extreme circumstances, it could be done much more quickly than the years it might usually take to prepare and plan and pilot and do all of those things. The second thing I think it really showed us is what's feasible when you can change the dial on your risk tolerance. So as I'm sure we'll get into a bit more, we operate in a very conservative sector where the balance between safety and the status quo largely outweighs the possibility of what might be new if it's untested and unproven. And whether it was vaccine development, where if money's not a matter and you can throw $10 billion at a problem, you can do things in parallel instead of in sequence, right? You can start to ramp up manufacturing before you ever have clinical trial data because millions of lives are at stake. So it allowed us to understand in both the biomedical side as well as the care delivery side what's actually possible. And hopefully what we take away from that is a better understanding of the constraints we put in our own way that we often try to externalize to say why things can't happen when in fact we've just now proven that they can. On the challenges, I think two things I'd point to. One, exactly as Aaron said, it's exposed huge inequities, both at the local level around the US, but also on a global level. This is something that we tracked in terms of what was happening with global vaccinations day by day for the last 2 years. And we saw anywhere from a 10-fold to a 100-fold difference in terms of access to vaccines if you were living in a low-income country in sub-Saharan Africa versus if you were living in a high-income country in Western Europe or in North America. So it gets back to those principles I talked about. Is it's great that we saw things that were effective, that they were certainly scalable, and we scaled to manufacture more than 12 billion vaccines within the first 12 months of them being available, which is about double the total annual vaccines that are usually given for all vaccines. So it's absolutely amazing feat. It's sustainable because there was funding to pay for it in the midst of a pandemic, but we sort of failed on that equitable component about the way that we went through this process. I think the other challenge we saw was really that in the US and in many other countries, we have unfortunately disconnected what we call our public health infrastructure from our care delivery infrastructure. And we've underinvested in the public health piece of this for decades and decades. And turns out what you need is much more public health than care delivery in the midst of a global health emergency. So hopefully this also teaches us that that in public health, healthcare delivery are really two sides of the same coin going forward.
Absolutely. No, all wonderful points that we have often on the technology side tried to get adoption for virtual care models and things of the sort, but there was resistance on a lot of fronts, on the payer community and the provider community. So hopefully the traction that we've gained in reimagining care delivery models is something that that will stay with us. But Krishna, since you're still here, well, obviously you're still here, but you touched on something that is a perfect segue to my next question, which is healthcare is a historically risk-averse industry. We typically think in terms of if I make a mistake, someone dies. So change is often we're slow adopters. So how do you address the needed culture changes within your organizations in order to have them embrace and adopt innovation? And feel free to be as tactical as possible, so our audience has some ideas of how maybe they can implement culture changes for innovation in their own areas.
Yeah, and you're right, innovation is hard because change is hard in the health industry, especially in the care delivery environment. And when we've looked at this over and over in our own system, but in many others in the US and around the world as well, it's pretty consistent that what it takes is really inspired leadership at the organizational level. So the senior people within an organization have to not just acknowledge it, but believe in it and be real champions of innovation for their own organizations. The second is that's got to then diffuse to the front lines, both on the clinical side as well as the management side. So the people that are closest to the problem have to feel empowered, that they can start to solve those problems, test new things without the risk of a failure being a terrible thing, right? Because we're in healthcare, we are talking about people's health and lives. We have to have an understanding of what are the parameters, what are the guardrails of what we can test or experiment on. But within those guardrails, empowering frontline clinicians, frontline managers to really start to come up with ideas, test them, figure out how to diffuse them more effectively across the organization is really important. And the third thing I'd point to is there has to be some slack in the system, right? In care delivery, the point we've tried to drive home now for the last 2 decades is efficiency. Mm-hmm. And so in our operations, we want to be efficient. We're tracking what happens every minute with every person's time. We're tracking the turnover rate of operating rooms. So we're taking away the natural outlets for creativity and inspiration. So that has to be somewhere. So you've got to have enough slack in the system that people can actually think of new ideas, can test new ideas, and have pathways. So most of what most people do every day should absolutely be standard of care, quality improvement. Let's get a little bit better at everything we do every day. But some material perspective, 10, 20% of an organization's effort really needs to be about new things. Otherwise, they're going to become obsolete eventually.
Absolutely. And so this is now the second time you've brought up experimentation being a critical component of innovation. But I like how you touched on, I think this is really important, that we have to allow that ability to experiment and to fail fast, obviously, and not fear reprisals, which is something our industry has not historically been very good at. So having leadership buy into a culture of innovation by allowing people and enabling their frontline teams to experiment, to get those learnings, and you can even celebrate things that don't work because you learned something from that, and how do you apply that to the next iteration and the next experiment. So I think that it's just a common thread for everyone, that experimentation is a real critical component of innovation. Aaron, also would like you to address the culture changes. You've also, both in the healthcare space, in the government space, all very slow moving organizations. How do you encourage the adoption of innovation in a culture change capacity?
That's a great question. So we do a lot of research and development of different sorts in systems engineering with the private sector, with government in particular. And we found a few things to be true generally. One is you have to be aware when people are bringing innovation that you really have to understand how it looks in implementation. An example is we have more cyber people, I think, than anywhere except the US government working at MITRE. I'm not one of them, I'm not cyber smart, but some of those wicked smart people came to work on health, and they were looking at hacking respirators and things like that. And they said, oh, well, people aren't doing software updates. You know, they need to make sure they take the respirators offline to do the software update. Well, anyone in healthcare knows you can't just take a bunch of respirators offline to update them. If people are attached to them, then they'll die, and that's bad, right? So just like really understanding as you're flying the knowledge to a new space, and also really understanding the space. You know, I've had also folks come over from defense and say, well, the government just has to tell all the doctors to do it this way. And it's like, that's not how the healthcare system works. They don't have the authority, right? That's not a thing in healthcare. So really understanding that on the user side is so important, to be able to go in and create. I mean, you know, I think Krishna and Shang already mentioned creating value. I mean, you have to demonstrate value, not just to the system and to the patients, which is really the goal, but also to the users, right? Like everyone along the way. So we've had pretty good success in creating change by, you kind of have your small group of early adopters who are willing to come in and try something new. And oftentimes we're involved in creating that safe space. Like we have Cynthia, which is artificial patient data, which mirrors other data that you could run analyses on and test on without triggering HIPAA or worrying about other. You know, there are kinds of ways to make sandboxes to make the testing possible in ways that don't actually risk people's lives. And then you take the early adopters and you get them to work together. And then as they see how it works for them, how it saves them time, how it protects the patients or makes, you know, improves their care, then you can then you get more and more people, and you kind of build out from there. And that's the model that we've used with government sponsors. That's the model that we've used with the private sector. And it seems to work pretty well. And governance is also a really big issue in all of it, that the people involved in it have to have a say in how it's progressing. So if you have that combination of things, it helps to bring people along who are, I would say, maybe appropriately risk averse. I don't really want my doctor to be trying all kinds of crazy things when I go in as a patient, right? Let's see what happens, right? I'm good with the standard of care. So that's what we found.
That's great. So it's funny, there's an intersection between something you said earlier and just now, that learning from other industries, identifying that adjacent possible, but you can't lift and shift that wholesale without expertise from the industry saying, you really can't just take people off respirators willy-nilly to do major updates. So I think having that interdisciplinary approach of expertise will often yield, the better answers. Before we move on, I actually want to address Carrie's comment in the chat box, and we can talk more about this during Q&A. You are 1,000% right. I think the 21st Century Cures Act that was originally passed in 2016, its initial intent was to accelerate innovation in biomedical devices, pharmaceutical life sciences, and they got mired in their own issues, especially around data, which is what we're going to pivot to in a moment. So I think for anyone who hasn't seen it, definitely take a look at that chat that Carrie put in, because that is correct. We in order to bring innovations to market faster, and Chong's talked a lot about that in terms of accelerating vaccine research, drug discovery. We need the regulatory bodies to keep up with our capabilities. So yeah, you see it every day. Oh, absolutely. So right now I'd like to pivot the discussion to what is probably, at least in my mind, the most foundational building block for healthcare and life sciences innovation, and that's data. The volume and velocity of data that is generated by our industry is immense, and we are literally just scratching the surface on what it can and should do, and how to take these data elements, what a modern data structure it might need to look like in order to leverage it for innovation. So I'm definitely going to get our panelists individually to talk about different areas based on their backgrounds. So Aaron, I'm going to go back to you, because there's a lot of data, or there's a lot of interest in using health and other data to support innovation. And before we can do any of that, we have to set up a system of sharing data. And what considerations do we need in terms of privacy and equity? And please touch on any obstacles that get in the way of being able to do that.
Sure, thanks. It's such an important topic. There's a lot of interest in data and health data, in sharing it, leveraging it, and creating sort of a learning system within the healthcare system so that care improves as we get more data. And it requires a reasonable shift, right? First, we do have to be conscious of privacy and equity issues. I'm a little bit of I am the weirdo that turns off the location on their phone unless they're using it. Like, that's the way that I am with, I don't trade my email address for $5 off. But I understand that I am very much a dinosaur and in the minority of my approach to privacy. But it is important, the idea of, I think really the flip side of privacy is autonomy and sort of control of the data. Who gets to decide where it goes, how it's used, what are the risks to people, if and as it's exposed, and just going in eyes open, really, not that we shouldn't share data, but that we figure out how to share data so that we're really looking at and mitigating risks, and that we're figuring out how to put control to the extent possible in the hands of the person whose data it is. Because there are a lot of data altruists who really want to share their data to make things better. I work with many of them. I'm sorry to say I'm a little bit more privacy focused. I'm not as good a person maybe as some of my colleagues who are more excited to share their data. But there's a lot that we can learn about it, and how to sort of spark it. The obstacles that get in the way are many. Some of them are, about the system. And there's a great colleague of mine who talks about, it's not just that the data exists, but even where it is, using an envelope in the postal system as the example. Like, yeah, the address and the return address are both there, but if we hadn't agreed ahead of time that the address goes here and the return address goes here, then the data could be there and no one would know how to interpret it, right? Like, so it's the same, similar idea in the health system. And really understanding as well what the barriers are, Like, why doesn't it exist now? Why don't we know a definitive cause of death for everyone, right? Or what the outcome was of each treatment? Well, it takes time to put that in, right? So there's a little bit of a burden on providers. Or why don't health systems just share their data interchangeably, or EHR vendors? Turns out there are economic incentives that people want to keep their patients and they want to keep the data, right? And we saw some of those barriers broken down, at least temporarily, during COVID, but the economic incentives haven't changed. So it really requires, I think, a view of the whole system in order to be able to create a situation in which the data are shared more for the benefit of everyone, where we are learning all the things that we could be learning together.
Absolutely. I think in addition to the economic incentives, which are huge, we're being faced with a fundamental reframing of who owns the data. Is it the health system that collects it? Is it me because it's my data? And if the health systems start sharing that information, who needs to say it's okay? Do you need my permission because it's my personal health data, or does it become yours? So historically, because I grew up in the provider side of healthcare, the data belonged to the hospitals. Just like if you donated blood, or you got blood drawn at a hospital, well, it's in my lab, it's my blood. But we're really starting to rethink that now. That data that's going into caring for people is coming from multiple sources and no longer just generated in one place. So I think that is something that the industry is going to continue to combat, is understanding where privacy needs to be, and how to protect that information as everything is continually digitized.
You know, it's worth noting, just as an aside, as we moved in, I'll get out of the way so I'll let my co-presenters talk. But it's not just data from health systems that informs healthcare. Credit card data, purchase data, like insurance, like all.
Excellent point.
You know, health insurance systems buy other data and use them to make their decisions, not just from the healthcare system. So looking at you as a whole, looking at, you know, groups of people and the like, holistically, and understanding how all the data that's out there, a lot of it without, because HIPAA only applies to certain kinds of data, and only if certain kinds of people have it. So if Google's collecting health data because they know that you searched, you know, pregnancy test, and then you searched nursery items, and then you searched, you know, heart defect, infant heart defect, like that isn't covered by HIPAA. Like, so whatever Google can learn about you and your healthcare and use elsewhere, you know, that's more generally available. So
absolutely, yeah, that's a very good point. Krishna, so I'd like to pivot a little bit to the role of data privacy internationally, because with your role being very global, we have HIPAA in the US, the EU has GDPR, sorry, I always do that. But you're working in emerging markets as well. So what is the approach to data that you are seeing globally?
Yeah, if we look around the world, there's a huge spectrum, right? In some cases, it's actually much more advanced than anything that we allow through HIPAA or GDPR. So if you look at a place like Singapore, it's quite advanced. They have data protection at a national level. They have the ability to connect data from different health systems across the country. They, with permission of users, are collecting data from wearables as part of their health promotion board to make sure that they're getting into the wellness related health data as well, and being able to think about national population health management as a real thing and not just as a concept, because they've created that environment. On the other hand, there are a lot of countries that don't have any policies in place. We, for the last 5 years, have been working in East Africa and have looked country by country at what exists. And even when there might be a policy on paper, what actually happens in practice, because almost none of those policies are actually enforced either. And what we have done is actually pull on global best practices, bring in experts from around the world, and developed what in Africa now is the first time has been adopted at a regional level, a health data policy framework that says here are the principles that are really important around data privacy, data safety, the ability to understand who can create access? Is it the patient? Is it the person that owns this data? And how do they provide access to it? For what purposes? And now that has been actually endorsed by the ministers of multiple countries and is being put into place as actual policy that can be implemented. And for us, this is really exactly, Chrissy, like you said, the anchor point of allowing health systems to improve, to innovate. You have to have a policy that enables safe and appropriate access to health-related data, because that is going to be the way that we improve health and healthcare going forward. So that's been something that we continue to work on, and I think continues to be a challenge. In our global learnings, the other thing that really strikes home is that in most other industries and in most other countries, the movement toward digitization is really about efficiency and about equity in terms of reaching populations that are hard to reach, especially at the last mile. And we see a very different model in the US. We've gone to lots and lots of digital models in the US. We have electronic health records. We have lots of movements toward digitization, but they've almost exclusively added to total cost of care and added to a system that actually isn't a system at all. So I think if we're going to start to see the benefits of data and digitization in the US, there has to be some overview of how it's actually creating efficiency and squeezing some costs out of the system, which we have yet to see.
Absolutely. Very excellent points. And we could probably spend another hour just talking about what digitization, the vision is versus the current reality. So Chong, I think one of the things we fail to recognize is that patient data doesn't just live in healthcare, that patient data is also foundational to innovations in the life sciences space. So can you talk us through an example or two of how patient data is utilized in your life sciences industry to drive innovation?
Yeah, happy to. I mean, it's interesting, right? When we had the human genome sequence, we thought we had, taken, we had now, in our hand the key to, everything that there's to know about human medicine and life, and that's obviously simply not true, right? With the genomic data, we need to have phenotypical data, which is, the electronic medical record, the wearables, everything in combination, and those data today is just, at least in the US, right, very fragmented, and in other parts of the country, some better, some they just live on paper, right? And I mean, maybe before I go into some of the examples, I'd love to also echo what Krishna said about some of the developing markets where you actually have an opportunity to go in and almost blank paper, right? How one would think about data and really set up a system that achieves the fine balance of both protecting the privacy, encouraging the trust, but also offers the openness and flexibility to allow the proper use of those data, which is fascinating to us. I mean, we invest globally, and we've invested in, for example, in China, kind of a China's Flatiron. I don't know if people know of Flatiron, but oncology data company that was acquired by Roche. Yeah, Chrissy, I mean, you're obviously very familiar with them. I mean, with the notion of, hey, like if there's a way to get to a large amount of data, right, in the market where, there's an opportunity to do so with maybe hopefully low cost, then what can we do with that, right? And in which case, I mean, China doesn't have HIPAA regulation really. And when we look at that company, or we co-founded that company, we really need to kind of really implement a HIPAA-like or HIPAA kind of translated kind of framework in place to make that we're comfortable with the privacy protection and ownership issues. But that aside, I mean, I think looking back in the US at least, right, when we are facing a already existing kind of system where data is fragmented and it's kind of siloed, then I guess as investors we have yet to see a grand solution that would solve the big problem that Aaron and Krishna proposed. Obviously, if we see one, we'll pile our money onto it. aside from like barring that, what we have been doing is just kind of maybe investing solutions that help us to get around some of the barriers that we see today, right? So, one of the examples is a company called Alcan that's, in New York and in Europe, which is leveraging, an approach called federated learning, which means you don't really take data out of, away from the hospital system. So data would live within the parameters of the firewall systems. But then if if you sign up to be part of their data network, then it's the algorithm that travels, goes into the firewall, gets trained by local data, and with the adjusted algorithm or the adjusted parameters of the algorithm, then travels back to the central cloud. That way, the algorithms get trained with essentially data that's available to them, but those data never leaves the local firewall, right? So that hopefully provides additional protection and comfort of mind for the health systems. We've also invested in companies that essentially provides a whole tech stack, cloud-based, and that fully compliant with regulations that kind of provides the total solution of data storage and, kind of analytical, all that, and sharing, standardization, all those, which more and more companies are starting to use because they see that as kind of, the future where they recognize the importance of data in biomedical research. So I think those kind of, I would call them, maybe more incremental innovation is happening in the industry that hopefully will be helpful. But 100% agree with my fellow panelists that hopefully a kind of a higher level grand solution in terms of addressing some of the big topics would eventually be achieved. So
fabulous. I think you touched on, two very important topics. One, I love that you brought up the Flatiron Roche story, because that was the first big example in our industry that showed the monetary value of data. And just having that oncology data was tremendous to Roche in order to conduct the research, the observational database research that's necessary. I also think that when we're talking about clinical trials, you need patient data for enrollment for pharmaceutical companies. When you're looking at advancing any type of research in the life sciences industry, it's really predicated on starting with the patient and that information. And I know we only have 10 minutes left. The last question I have, and this will be for everyone, so I know I'm going to ask you to keep it short and sweet. We talk about innovation, and what we've been talking about predominantly is internal innovation, how we get our organizations to innovate. I want to talk just a little bit about external innovation and the things that we are seeing coming from outside, whether it's disrupting or adding value to the organization. So I'm going to start with Krishna because of his role within the global startup community, but I'd like to have you just talk briefly about what you're seeing in the external innovation that's impacting our organization or our industry.
Yeah, the startup community is really critical for the future of healthcare as a really important source of innovation, of new ideas. Often startups that are led by people outside the health sector, right, gets to a point that's been made earlier, that people that are not sort of have the blinders on of what's possible today are the ones that are going to help us transform for what's actually possible in the future. On the flip side, what we see is that startups on their own are almost never going to actually move the needle in the health sector, because you have to work through entrenched and large systems, whether those is in the public or private sector. So the magic is really in that intersection of how do you really empower private sector innovation through startups, through other industries, and have a mechanism to try to adapt or to integrate different types of solutions into systems that can actually help take it to scale. And when that happens, I think we've seen really phenomenal innovation take place. So one small example is an organization in India that's called Narayana Health. They're now about 20 years old, probably the second or third largest health system in India, so providing millions of patient visits every year. But innovation and this idea of frugal innovation at their core, and their founder is famous for saying, if a solution's not affordable, it's not a solution. So what they try to do is drive down the cost of everything that they do while keeping the highest quality measures the constant. So how do we get the best outcomes, the highest quality care for the lowest cost? And that's how they motivate their own teams. And they've gotten to a point where they can do open heart surgery, a CABG, something that costs, for an uncomplicated case, $80,000 to $100,000 in the US, and they're doing it with the same outcomes for less than $2,000 a case.
Wow.
So when we think about innovation, we really want to find those organizations that have figured out how to scale outcomes with orders of magnitude difference in costs or other key variables.
Nice. And thank you. I have so much thoughts about that, but I'm going to skip that for now. Chong, you're an investor space. You're seeing these organizations that Krishna is talking about. How are you seeing this in life sciences and that external innovation components affecting the industry?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, I think in the life sciences industry, two kind of external, right? One, kind of learnings from maybe some other industries that can be applied to biomedical research. For example, we've talked about the use of machine learning and data, really try to address some of the problems that we're facing today, which is it's just such a long and costly process to develop a molecule, right? So how you can leverage some of those awesome developments in technology to try and shorten that. But the other thing is just kind of like things like that, something that Krishna mentioned that really, made me think, which is, some of the external in the traditional geographical sense, right? Meaning, innovation that happens all over the world. I mean, for the longest time, US and maybe Europe are where the majority of the life sciences innovation happens, most of the drugs that get developed. I think today things are rapidly changing, right? I mean, the research that's happening in Japan, in China, in India are just picking up speed, and similar examples in terms of for example, drug pricing, right? Same PD-1 antibodies in China is costing less than 1/10 of the price today than it is in the US. And how can we just kind of, and there are multiple PD-1 drugs in the market. So talking about free market and competition, you should be able to, in some way drive that price down, but that's not yet happening, right? So how do you kind of even, try and see if we can leverage some of that to help address some of the problems at home. So I mean, I don't know if that's even innovation at its core sense in terms of life sciences innovation, but that's something that just kind of gets us thinking every day in many ways.
Absolutely is. And Aaron, I mean, you've been at this intersection of public and private and partnerships. Same question around external innovation and what you're seeing.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think it's, I work primarily with the federal government, but we're aware that most of the innovation isn't happening in the government, it's happening outside, right? So the government funds it, the government regulates it, the government maybe pays for the ultimate thing to get to patients. But isn't, and there are innovations that come from government, but it's not the primary source that we're looking at. There's a lot of interest generally in platforms, different kinds of things that can accelerate innovation broadly, or that can be things that can be reused in order to be able to continue with innovations building on past things. We also actually developed a strategy to accelerate biomedical innovation that we're working with many of our federal sponsors that has 4 main elements, bearing in mind, we're talking to the government about, well, how can you make this go faster? Mm-hmm. And there are 4 things that we found. One is measure. Interestingly, HHS, the Department of Health and Human Services, responsible for like the health and well-being of the citizenry, doesn't have a good dashboard of where innovation is. Like as it moves from beginning to end, it's kind of siloed, right? And different components know, but even the data sharing within the department, across HHS and being able to track, well, what's coming, is tricky. So measure is a big one. Another one is pull. So right now, the way that innovation works is it's sort of a push, like NIH funds at the beginning, and then researchers go out and have to become CEOs and attract venture capital funding and get spun up in order to be able to go through FDA and go to CMS and get reimbursement. And we thought, like, well, what would it be like if instead HHS or CMS said, hey, here's what we want, right? Like, we want this, and not like a specific part, but we want this outcome. That would light up. I mean, my private sector people can tell me, but I understand, anyone who understands finance, that would light up the investment industry. That would pull innovation and get the markets going in a way that was, that worked well with what the major health burdens were and what was needed. Another one is Align. We did a lot of modeling looking at what would happen, because there's downtime in the system right now. It's a siloed thing. Payment, this happens, and then you wait and you get to the next thing, and this happens and you wait and you get to the next thing. Not that we're going to try to say, FDA, don't take your time and look closely and make sure things are safe. But what would happen if we reduce the air gaps, right? Well, there's a concept that's really common in finance about net present value, right? Is something investable or not, based on where it is now, based on the timeline and the uncertainty in the air gaps. It turns out if you can reduce those, you actually, again, can attract a lot more investment and a lot more innovation to move many more shots on goal along. Finance is another big one. Things like bond financing that are known in other industries, using it in health could be revolutionary, right? It would be a huge thing if there were bonds to kind of, especially aligned to priorities and with, that you were measuring and pulling things through. And digitize. I mean, just like we've been talking about all along, having a digital strategy that helps to support all this happening is really, really important. I'll put a link to this strategy. It's just a brief write-up if anybody's interested in taking a look. But this is something that it's not going to happen tomorrow. Do you know what I mean? We're building champions, but it's something that we're looking at very seriously and trying to mobilize across the government.
Great. Well, thank you. Eric, I guess I thank you guys all so much, but got a little excited in our Q&A part.
No, sounds great. Y'all are perfect. We're right at the end of the hour. So I just want to say thank you, Chrissy, Chong, Krishna, and Aaron. Thank you for your time today. Thank you for the information. It's been great. So thank you.